Before there was an undercover hitman, a staged crime scene, or a supposedly grieving wife crying behind police tape, there was a whirlwind marriage built on incomplete stories. Both Dahlia and Michael DiPolito entered that marriage carrying secrets, and neither of them seemed especially eager to ask too many questions. This was Boynton Beach, Florida, in 2009, a coastal city in Palm Beach County with a population of roughly 68,000 people. It was the kind of place associated with fishing boats, warm weather, beaches, and ordinary suburban homes sitting only minutes from the water. On the surface, it was an easy place to imagine starting over, and that seems to be what Michael believed he was doing. Dahlia was working as both a real estate agent and an escort when Michael first contacted her. This did not begin with two strangers meeting at a coffee shop or being introduced by friends. Michael called for an escort, and Dahlia was the woman who answered. There was one immediate complication. Michael was married. His wife at the time was a woman named Maria. Whatever boundaries were supposed to exist in that marriage disappeared once Michael met Dahlia. What began as a paid encounter quickly developed into an affair, and then into something both Michael and Dahlia described as a real relationship. It moved fast. Extremely fast. Michael and Maria filed for divorce after his infidelity came to light. And honestly, Maria's decision is not difficult to understand. Finding out that your husband has been calling escorts would be enough. Finding out that he had apparently fallen in love with one of them takes it to an entirely different level. Once that divorce became official, Michael did not spend much time alone. 5 days later, on February 2nd, 2009, he married Dahlia. 5 days. Think about that for a second. One marriage had barely ended on paper before the next one began. There was no long pause, no careful transition, and apparently no period in which either of them stepped back to ask whether this relationship had moved too quickly. From the outside, though, they could look convincing. There were romantic photographs, domestic moments, a house in a Florida beach town. Dahlia would later describe the relationship as one filled with intense chemistry and affection. They appeared to be building a life together, and Michael seemed completely invested in the idea that this was his fresh start. But fresh starts become complicated when the past is still sitting in the room. Michael had a serious criminal history. He had been involved in a fraudulent telemarketing operation that took money from people through foreign currency investment schemes. He served 2 years in prison, and after his release, he remained under an extraordinarily long probation term, 28 years. That is not a detail you casually forget to mention to a new spouse. Dahlia claims she did not know about Michael's record when their relationship began. According to her version, she only discovered the truth when a probation officer appeared at their home. Michael told a very different story. He maintained that Dahlia knew about his background from the beginning. Those accounts cannot both be right. Either Michael concealed a major part of his life until a probation officer showed up at the door, or Dahlia later pretended to have been kept in the dark. And that disagreement matters because so much of what came afterward would depend on one basic question. How well did these two people really know each other? Maybe they were comfortable overlooking inconvenient truths. Maybe each believed the other person's secrets could be managed. Or maybe the relationship worked because neither one wanted to examine it too closely. There was another strange detail about their life together. They reportedly enjoyed reality television, including Cheaters and The Real Housewives of New York. Yes, Cheaters. A man who had left his wife after beginning a relationship with an escort was now sitting beside his new wife watching a television show built around exposing infidelity. You really could not write the irony any more cleanly than that. According to Dahlia, Michael also wanted the two of them to appear on a reality show someday. That desire would later become far more important than either of them could have imagined. Cameras, performance, and the idea of turning private chaos into television would eventually sit at the center of Dahlia's defense. At this point, though, it was apparently just something the couple talked about. Michael liked the idea of being on television. And here's what gets me. Michael was already living with the kind of history most people would want to keep far away from a camera. He had a fraud conviction, a long probation sentence, and a life that was beginning to attract police attention again. One evening, after Michael had taken Dahlia to dinner, police pulled him over. During the stop, an officer found white powder inside a cigarette package. Michael insisted that it did not belong to him. He was nearly arrested, but the officer ultimately allowed him to leave. Then came the anonymous tips. Police began receiving calls claiming Michael was dealing drugs. For someone already serving a decades-long probation term, even an accusation could be dangerous. A new arrest or probation violation could send him back into the criminal justice system he had been trying to escape. Michael became frightened that his past was catching up with him. Look at the situation from his perspective. He already had a federal fraud conviction. Police had found suspicious powder during a traffic stop. Anonymous callers were now directing officers toward him. Whether those accusations were true or not, he had reason to believe that the walls were closing in. So Michael made a decision that he apparently thought would protect him. He transferred the title to his house into Dahlia's name. That transfer changed the balance of the marriage. The house they shared no longer legally belonged to Michael. On paper, it belonged to his new wife, the woman he had married only days after ending his previous marriage. Michael appears to have viewed the transfer as asset protection. If police arrested him, or if his legal problems became worse, he believed placing the property in Dahlia's name might keep it safe. But safe for whom? That is where the psychology of this case begins to shift. Was Dahlia helping her husband protect their home while he navigated the consequences of his past? Or was she being placed in control of the most valuable thing he owned? At that moment, Michael seems to have trusted her. He had rushed from one marriage directly into another, accepted Dahlia's version of their love story, and handed her legal control of the house. Whatever doubts he may have had, they were not enough to stop him. And Dahlia had now gained something substantial from a relationship that was only months old. None of that proves murderous intent. A fast marriage is not evidence of a crime. Watching reality television is not evidence of a crime. Even transferring a house to a spouse can have an innocent explanation, especially when one person is worried about creditors, probation, or another arrest. But taken together, the details made this marriage unusually unstable from the beginning. It started with infidelity. It carried the weight of Michael's criminal history. The couple disagreed about what Dahlia knew and when she knew it. Police kept receiving anonymous accusations. Suspicious powder appeared during a traffic stop. And then the house ended up solely in Dahlia's name. By the summer of 2009, they had been married for only about 6 months. From the outside, they could still look like a couple enjoying a new life in a Florida beach town. Behind that image, though, trust and ownership had become tangled together. Was Dahlia building a future with Michael? Or was she quietly positioning herself to control what he owned? At that point, there was no proof that she wanted him dead. There was only a rushed marriage, a trail of conflicting stories, and a husband who had placed his home in his new wife's hands. Then someone from Dahlia's past went to the police. He said she had asked for help with a problem that could not be solved by divorce papers. On July 31st, 2009, Dahlia did not approach a stranger in a dark alley. She contacted a man she already knew, met him in a gas station parking lot, and allegedly asked for help arranging her husband's murder. His name was Mohammed Shihada, sometimes identified in accounts of the case as Mohammed. He was not simply a random acquaintance. Mohammed and Dahlia had known each other for years, and he described their past relationship as sexual. More importantly, he was someone Dahlia believed she could turn to when she needed something. Sometimes that meant money. Sometimes it meant a favor. Sometimes she apparently just wanted somebody to listen. That history matters. A request like this would sound absurd coming from a stranger. But Dahlia was speaking to a man who already knew her, someone she apparently trusted enough to hear the darkest version of what she said was happening inside her marriage. According to Mohammed, Dahlia told him that things with Michael had become unbearable. She claimed Michael was abusing her. She said she wanted out, needed help, and could not continue living the way she was living. Those were Dahlia's claims. They were the justification she gave Mohammed during that conversation. Not an established finding that proved what was happening inside the home, and certainly not an explanation that made what came next acceptable. Because Dahlia did not tell Mohammed she wanted help finding a shelter. She did not ask for a lawyer. She did not ask him to help her leave town or collect her belongings. She said divorce was not enough. She wanted Michael dead. And she allegedly put the request to Mohammed in the most direct possible terms. Would he kill her husband? Or did he know somebody who would? Think about how quickly that changes the nature of the conversation. One moment, Mohammed is listening to someone describe a troubled marriage. The next, he is being asked to participate in a killing. There is a huge difference between a person saying, in anger, "I wish he were dead," and that same person asking, "Can you find someone to do it?" One can be an ugly outburst. The other can be solicitation. But at that moment, Mohammed was the only person who had heard it. There was no recording. No undercover officer, no payment exchanged in front of police, no written contract conveniently labeled murder for hire. There was only Muhammad's account of a conversation in a parking lot and the possibility that Michael DiPolito's life was in danger. Muhammad told Dahlia no. Then he went to the Boynton Beach Police Department. His explanation was simple. The thought that somebody might actually be killed was bothering his conscience. Whatever history he and Dahlia shared, whatever favors she had asked of him before, this was different. If he ignored it and Michael ended up dead, Muhammad would know that he had been warned in advance. So he told investigators what Dahlia had allegedly asked him. She wanted to know whether he knew someone who could kill her husband. He also repeated one of the stranger contradictions from their conversation. Dahlia had described Michael as the nicest, sweetest nerd, according to Muhammad, while also saying she could not stand him. That is the kind of detail detectives pay attention to. It does not prove a murder plot by itself, but it sounds less like a simple report of immediate danger and more like a deeply conflicted, or calculated, description of the person she wanted removed. Still, police had a problem. Muhammad's information was alarming, but it was incomplete. During the first interview, he could describe Dahlia physically. Dark hair, green eyes, attractive, somewhere around 5'6" or 5'7". But he was uncertain about basic identifying details. He did not know exactly where she lived. He was not even sure of her last name. That is not a small issue. Imagine being the detective receiving this report. A man walks into the station and says a former lover asked him to arrange her husband's murder, but he cannot immediately provide her full identity or direct police to her home. Is he telling the truth? Is he exaggerating? Did he misunderstand her? Is this retaliation after a personal relationship went bad? Is there even a husband named Michael in danger? And if the allegation is real, how much time do you have before someone acts on it? The police could not afford to dismiss Muhammad, but they also could not afford to treat every part of his story as proven simply because he had walked through the door and repeated it. They had to verify two things at once, the woman and the threat. First, they needed to identify Dahlia with certainty. A physical description and a first name were not enough for a case this serious. They needed to establish where she lived, whom she was married to, and whether the intended target was a real, identifiable person. Then they needed evidence of intent. That word, intent, is where cases like this become complicated. People say reckless things during fights. They vent. They exaggerate. They perform for attention. They may even ask hypothetical questions that sound terrible without taking any step toward making them real. Police needed to determine whether Dahlia's words belonged in that category or whether she was actively attempting to hire someone. Arresting her immediately might have protected Michael in the short term, but it also risked leaving investigators with little more than Muhammad's allegation against her denial. Dahlia could say he had invented the entire conversation. She could claim he had misunderstood her. She could argue that she had been emotional and never intended for anyone to act. And Muhammad's uncertainty about her last name and address would give that denial room to breathe. So investigators brought him back in and pushed for more detail. They wanted to know exactly what she had said, how serious she appeared to be, whether she had asked him directly to find a killer, and whether she might repeat the request. That last possibility changed everything. If Muhammad contacted Dahlia again, police could stop relying solely on his memory. They could listen to her own words. They could hear whether she backed away, laughed it off, or explained that she had never been serious. Or they could hear her begin planning. Of course, asking Muhammad to go back carried its own risks. He was not a trained undercover detective. He was a civilian entering a conversation with a woman he believed wanted her husband killed. If Dahlia became suspicious, she could shut down completely. She could warn Michael. She could seek out somebody else. She might even decide Muhammad himself had become a liability. There was also the danger of pushing too hard. Investigators needed Dahlia to speak voluntarily. The point was not for Muhammad to invent a plan and pressure her into accepting it. The point was to give her an opportunity to explain what she wanted in her own language. So Muhammad became a confidential informant. Police planned a controlled follow-up meeting at a place familiar to both of them, a mobile gas station where Muhammad and Dahlia had met before. Familiarity would make the contact feel natural. Dahlia would have less reason to wonder why he had chosen that location, and investigators could position themselves nearby while equipping Muhammad to record what happened. His car was fitted with cameras. A wire would capture the conversation. Muhammad would contact Dahlia, arrange the meeting, and give detectives the chance to identify her. Then he would raise the subject she had allegedly introduced the day before. This time, there would be no need to choose between his version and hers. If Dahlia had merely been venting, she could say so. If she had changed her mind, the recording would preserve that too. But if she believed Muhammad had found someone willing to kill Michael, her reaction could reveal whether the request had been an emotional outburst or the beginning of an actual transaction. That was the line police were trying to find. The first report gave detectives a lead, but not yet a complete case. Muhammad had identified a possible intended victim and described a direct request for murder, but the accusation still depended almost entirely on his word. His next conversation with Dahlia would have to answer the question investigators could not afford to guess at. Was she venting, or was she hiring? The detectives chose the riskier option. Instead of stopping her, they asked Muhammad to go back and let her explain the plan on tape. The recording did not begin with a long confession or a dramatic breakdown. It began with Dahlia discussing a professional killer as if she were arranging a routine service, and bringing cash to make the conversation real. After Muhammad Shihada went to the Boynton Beach Police Department, investigators still had a basic problem. They had his story, but at that point, that was all it was. Muhammad could describe Dahlia. He could tell them what she had allegedly asked him to do, but he did not know every piece of information the officers needed, and an accusation this serious could not rest on one man's word. They needed to identify the woman. They needed to establish that the intended target really was Michael DiPolito. Most importantly, they needed to hear the plan from Dahlia herself. So the police asked Muhammad to become a confidential informant. The next step was risky. Muhammad would contact Dahlia and arrange another meeting at a place they had used before, a mobile gas station. Investigators equipped his vehicle with hidden cameras and gave him a recording device to wear. His job was not to invent a murder plot for her. It was to get Dahlia talking about the plan she had allegedly already proposed. Think about what the police were trying to determine here. Was this an angry comment made during a private conversation? Was it fantasy? Was Muhammad exaggerating? Or even lying? Or was Dahlia genuinely looking for someone to kill her husband? The cameras would give them an answer. When Dahlia arrived, there was no long stretch of nervous small talk. No gradual attempt to work up the courage to mention Michael. She and Muhammad moved almost immediately into the subject of having him killed. And that tone matters. On the recording, Dahlia appeared remarkably direct. She did not sound like someone shocked by the direction of the conversation. She did not recoil when Muhammad discussed a professional killer. Instead, she participated in the details. Muhammad described the supposed hitman as someone who knew what he was doing. Someone whose job was simply to get it done. Dahlia wanted to know when. How would she know which day the killing would happen? What would she be expected to do? Would she need to leave town? Her answer to that last question was especially strange. Dahlia did not want to go out of town. She intended to stay nearby. Now, if your first concern is avoiding suspicion, distance would seem helpful. Spouses are routinely examined closely when someone is killed, and Dahlia seemed aware that people might look at her. She reportedly discussed whether Michael's mother would become suspicious and expressed confidence that no one would be able to point a finger at her. Yet she still wanted to remain close. That combination is unsettling. Concern about being suspected, paired with a refusal to create physical distance from the scene. It sounded less like hesitation and more like confidence. Dahlia appeared to believe that whatever story followed Michael's death, she would be able to manage it. Money also entered the conversation. Muhammad raised the question of whether Michael was worth killing over what Dahlia might gain. But Dahlia pushed back on the idea that this was simply about money. "It's not even about money," she said in the recorded exchange. That did not answer the larger question, of course. If financial gain was not the whole motive, then what was? Anger? A desire to escape the marriage? Another relationship? Control of the property Michael had placed in her name? Those possibilities would take on more meaning later. For the moment, investigators were focused on something much more immediate, whether she was taking concrete steps toward Michael's death. She was. Dahlia brought approximately $1,200 in cash. She apparently believed that the money would be passed to the killer and used, at least in part, to obtain a gun. She also supplied 2 photographs, including a picture of Michael. That moves the conversation into very different territory. This was no longer only an allegation that Dahlia had said something terrible in a parking lot. Police now had video of her discussing a supposed professional killer, talking about timing, worrying about suspicion, producing cash, and providing photographs of the intended target. Muhammad repeatedly checked her certainty. Was everything still okay? Was she sure? Dahlia was. At one point, Muhammad pushed back at the need for reassurance. She was planning a murder, he reminded her. How much more certain could she be? For investigators listening to the exchange, The original report was becoming credible very quickly. But Mohammed was not the person who could carry the operation all the way through. If Dahlia truly wanted to hire a killer, police needed to put someone in front of her who could convincingly play that role. That person was Boynton Beach police officer Woody Jean. Jean would pose as the contract killer Mohammed had supposedly located. The meeting was arranged in a CVS parking lot in Boynton Beach. Hidden cameras were positioned inside Jean's vehicle, including cameras placed toward the back of the car. The goal was to capture the entire interaction while allowing Dahlia to believe she was having a private conversation with a man who murdered people for money. Even for an experienced officer, this was not casual work. Jean later described feeling nervous because there were so many ways the operation could go wrong. Dahlia might recognize something was off. She might refuse to discuss the plan. She might walk away. Or the meeting might reveal that Mohammed had misunderstood everything. Then Dahlia arrived. She was wearing a sundress. Jean felt that she seemed almost flirtatious, as though she wanted to catch his attention. He complimented her appearance, playing into the role and the strange social rhythm of the encounter. And it was strange. She was allegedly meeting a man she believed would kill her husband, yet the interaction could almost look like a business appointment with a little personal charm layered over it. Dahlia treated Jean less like a figure from some terrifying criminal underworld and more like a service provider whose work she needed completed quickly. Jean began asking questions. How did she want this handled? How much was she prepared to pay? Was she completely certain that Michael had to die? Dahlia communicated urgency. According to Jean, she did not want this delayed. If he was going to do it, it needed to happen within the week. The $1,200 came up again. Dahlia apparently thought she had already provided that money as payment. Jean corrected that assumption. He explained that $1,200 was not the price of a contract killing. In the logic of his undercover role, that money had already gone toward expenses: a gun, a phone, a vehicle, and other preparations. The point was not merely to negotiate. Jean was testing whether financial pressure or the reality of the supposed preparations would make Dahlia step back. It did not. He told her, in effect, that he could carry out the killing however she wanted, but he needed to know this was truly what she wanted. He gave her an exit, more than once. Then he made the warning unmistakable. Once he left that meeting, she would not be able to contact him. She would not have an easy way to cancel. If she changed her mind tomorrow, it might already be too late. Jean wanted her to understand that she was not discussing an abstract possibility anymore. According to the role he was playing, the machinery was already moving. That was the moment when Dahlia gave the answer that would follow her through news reports, courtrooms, appeals, and years of public scrutiny. She was positive. Not 100%. Not even 1,000. 5,000% sure. She also told Jean that she was tougher than she looked. She understood that she might appear to be a cute, innocent young woman, but she insisted that appearance was misleading. For Jean, the most surprising part was how adamant she remained. The warnings did not produce panic. The suggestion that there was no turning back did not make her ask for more time. Each opportunity to stop became another recorded confirmation that she wanted the plan to continue. Jean finally described what Dahlia should expect. She would leave for the gym. By the time she returned, she would find a dead body inside the house. To be clear, no murder had occurred, and no police officer intended to kill Michael. What the recordings captured was the alleged solicitation and planning of a homicide, not a completed killing. But from the investigators' perspective, the evidence had changed dramatically. They no longer had only Mohammed's report. They had Dahlia on camera. They had discussions of money, photographs, timing, a weapon, the need to avoid suspicion, and the demand that Michael's death happen within the week. They had an undercover officer offering repeated chances to withdraw, and they had Dahlia's answer, delivered with a level of certainty that would become the defining phrase of the entire case: 5,000%. But the police still needed one final performance, one that would test not what Dahlia said to a supposed hitman, but how she behaved when she believed the plan had succeeded. August 5th, 2009, was supposed to be the day Michael disappeared from Dahlia's life. Instead, it became the day a television crew, a police department, and a supposedly grieving wife all entered the same carefully staged scene. The plan Dahlia had discussed with the undercover officer was brutally simple. She would leave the house early and go to the gym. While she was gone, the man she believed was a professional killer would enter the home, kill Michael, and arrange the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong. Then Dahlia would come back. she would find the police outside. She would learn that her husband was dead. And if everything worked the way she apparently expected, Michael's murder would look like the result of his own dangerous past rather than something arranged by the woman he had married 6 months earlier. By this point, Dahlia had allegedly paid the undercover officer approximately $7,000. This was no longer a vague conversation in a parking lot. In the eyes of investigators, the plot had reached its execution stage. Dahlia had supplied the urgency. She had discussed the method. She had been warned that once the supposed hitman left, she would not be able to contact him and call the whole thing off. And she had answered that warning by saying she was 5,000% sure. But there was a part of the operation Dahlia knew nothing about. The television program's Cops was filming with the Boynton Beach Police Department that week. If you have ever watched the show, you know the format. Camera crews follow officers through traffic stops, arrests, domestic calls, and active investigations. The whole appeal is that the audience feels as if it is standing right there beside law enforcement while events unfold. That made this sting unusually complicated. The police investigation itself was real. The recordings were real. The undercover officer was a real detective. Investigators genuinely believed they were intervening in a murder-for-hire plot. But the murder was fake. Michael's death was fake. And the crime scene waiting outside his home was going to be built from the ground up. That distinction would later become hugely important. Dahlia's defense would argue that the presence of cops influenced how Boynton Beach police handled the operation, turning a sting into something larger and more theatrical for television. Police maintained that the staging was necessary to convince Dahlia the plan had been carried out and to protect Michael from a threat they took seriously. Whatever you think about those competing arguments, the result looked startlingly real. While Dahlia was at the gym, officers moved into position around the house. They put up crime scene tape. Investigative vehicles arrived. Personnel gathered outside with the equipment and visual markers people associate with a violent break-in. The home was treated, from the street, as if it had become the center of an active homicide investigation. Think about the level of coordination that required. Every officer had to know the role they were playing. Michael had to remain safely out of sight. The cameras had to capture Dahlia's arrival without revealing the trap. And no one could accidentally say the one thing that would expose the operation too early. Then Dahlia received the call. Something had happened at her house, she was told. She needed to return immediately. By the time she arrived, the street already told a story. Tape blocked access to the property. Police vehicles surrounded the area. Officers stood between her and the house. The scene was designed to communicate disaster before anyone officially explained what that disaster was. A sergeant approached her and said police had received a report of a disturbance. Shots had been fired. Then he delivered the sentence the entire operation had been building toward. Michael had been killed. Dahlia began screaming. She repeatedly said no. She tried to move toward the house and asked to see him, but officers refused to let her cross the tape. They told her it was still a crime scene. She wanted access to Michael, to the home, to some physical confirmation of what she had just been told. It is tempting to watch that footage and declare that her reaction proves everything. Some viewers see a performance that starts too quickly, almost before the officer finishes delivering the news. Others see panic, confusion, or the uncontrolled response of someone hearing that her husband has been murdered. But footage cannot tell us exactly what someone feels internally. It shows behavior. It captures timing, words, movement, and expression. It does not come with a reliable window into motive, and that is what makes the scene so unsettling. If Dahlia believed the supposed hitman had followed through, then she had arrived expecting some version of this moment. She knew what police were likely to tell her. Yet she also had to react in front of officers as Michael's shocked wife, not as the person investigators believed had arranged his death. So was she genuinely overwhelmed by seeing the plan turned into something that looked real? Was she acting? Was it a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and performance? The video records the reaction. It does not settle that question by itself. The officers continued the illusion. They asked whether Michael had enemies. Was there anyone who might want to hurt him? Who had he been dealing with? They mentioned a witness supposedly seeing a black man running from the area, adding another detail to the fictional burglary and shooting. Every question gave Dahlia an opening. She could provide names. She could direct investigators toward Michael's past. She could help construct an explanation for why someone else might have wanted him dead. When she kept asking to enter the house, police told her that seeing Michael was not possible. If she wanted them to find his killer, they said she needed to cooperate. She would have to go with detectives to the station and tell them everything she knew about Michael, his connections, and anyone who might have held a grudge against him. Even the dogs were accounted for. Officers assured her they had been taken care of through animal control. Everything around her reinforced the same message. This was now a homicide scene. Michael was gone, and Dahlia was the surviving spouse whose information might help solve his murder. Except Michael was not gone. He was alive, protected by police, and about to watch his wife explain why someone else might have killed him. That is the reversal at the center of this case. Dahlia had allegedly expected Michael to become the silent victim in a burglary scene. Instead, he became a hidden witness to her behavior. She thought she was entering the story as the grieving wife. Investigators had already placed her in it as the suspect. At the station, detectives did not immediately confront her. They wanted the fiction to continue a little longer. As far as Dahlia knew, she was helping them investigate Michael's death. She was still tearful, but she began answering questions and offering possible reasons someone might have targeted him. Michael had been involved in shady things, she suggested. He had enemies. His efforts to get off probation had created problems, and there were people who might not have been happy about it. In another room, Michael watched the interview through a closed-circuit monitor. Imagine that for a second. You have just been told that your wife allegedly tried to pay someone to have you murdered. Police have hidden you while they stage your death. Now you are watching her sit with detectives, apparently believing the plan succeeded, and she is pointing toward your past as a possible explanation for your killing. For Michael, pieces that had seemed random began fitting together. There had been mysterious anonymous reports to police. There had been incidents that made him feel as though his old criminal life and probation problems were closing in around him again. Listening to Dahlia suggests that his enemies or associates might have wanted him dead. He began to suspect that she had been behind more than the murder-for-hire plot. It was, by his account, an awful realization, but also a strange kind of relief. Events that had not made sense now had a possible source, and Dahlia did not break. Michael later acknowledged that he was surprised by how composed she remained in the interview. She continued speaking with detectives as though she were assisting them. She did not know that her supposedly dead husband could hear her. She did not know that the cameras had captured far more than her reaction outside the house. And she did not know how close investigators were to ending the performance. The operation had already accomplished something extraordinary. Michael was alive. The alleged murder had been prevented. Police had recorded Dahlia arriving at a fabricated homicide scene and responding to the announcement that her husband was dead. But investigators still wanted to see what would happen when the two versions of reality collided. Dahlia thought she was helping police find a murderer. Then the detectives changed the question and made her look at the man she believed had killed her husband. Even after police told Dahlia that the hitman was an undercover officer and that everything had been recorded, she did not immediately collapse into a confession. Her answer was simpler. She had done nothing. But before that reveal, detectives gave her one last chance to tell the story as Michael's grieving wife. Inside the interrogation room, Dahlia still believed, or was at least being encouraged to believe, that her husband had been murdered. The officers treated her as someone who might help them identify his killer. They asked about Michael's background, his probation, his connections, and anyone who might want him dead. Dahlia offered possibilities. Michael had been involved in shady things. He had enemies. Some people were apparently unhappy that he was trying to get off probation. There had been problems surrounding that process. Maybe one of those people had decided to stop him permanently. It sounded like cooperation. But from the detective's perspective, it was misdirection. They already knew exactly who had arranged the supposed killing. They had heard Dahlia speak to Muhammad. They had watched her meet the undercover officer. They had recorded her discussing payment, timing, and the staged burglary. They had even heard her say that she was 5,000% sure. The interview was not really about finding a suspect. It was about seeing what Dahlia would say when she believed the plan had worked. And in another room, Michael was watching. Think about what that must have been like. Just hours earlier, police had told Michael that his wife had allegedly paid to have him killed. Now he was alive, hidden from her, listening as she calmly supplied detectives with alternative suspects. As Michael watched, earlier incidents began to look different. The anonymous calls to police, the reports portraying him as a drug dealer, the suspicious encounters that could have sent him back to prison. After the arrest, Michael came to believe Dahlia had been behind those calls as part of an effort to have him removed, and potentially leave her in control of the house and other assets he had placed in her name. That was Michael's interpretation, and it would later become part of the prosecution's broader theory. But in that room, before lawyers and juries began arguing over motive, it was a husband watching his marriage rearrange itself in real time. Then detectives changed the test. They brought the supposed hitman into the room in handcuffs. The undercover officer lowered his head, playing the role of a hired killer who had failed and been caught. Dahlia looked at him. Detectives asked whether she knew the man. She said no. Had she ever seen him before? Never. That denial matters because this was no longer an allegation being described to her. The man she had met in a parking lot was physically standing in front of her. She had sat in his car. She had discussed Michael's death with him. She had been warned there would be no way to cancel after he left. And now, with that same face only feet away, she denied recognizing him. Only then did detectives tell her what had really happened. The man was not a contract killer. He was a police officer. Her conversations had been recorded. Her meetings had been filmed. Police had photographs, audio, video, and evidence of the money exchanged. Michael was not dead. The crime scene outside their home had been staged, and Dahlia was under arrest for soliciting the first-degree murder of her husband. Her response remained the same. She had not done anything. Detectives repeated that everything was on tape. Dahlia insisted she wanted to go home. She said she was not a criminal and was not that kind of person. Even when officers placed her in handcuffs, her position did not noticeably shift. Then Michael appeared at the doorway. The second Dahlia saw him, she called out to him. She asked him to come into the room. She tried to tell him it was not serious, but Michael would not approach her. That brief moment stripped away the entire performance. There was no dead husband now. No unknown killer. No grieving widow helping detectives search for answers. Michael was alive, and Dahlia was the one being taken away. After she was booked, detectives questioned her again. This time, there was no staged investigation to maintain. They asked directly why she wanted Michael killed. Dahlia denied that she had. They told her it was on tape, not once, but repeatedly. They played audio from her own conversation and asked whether it was her voice. Still, she would not admit to arranging a murder. So what are we hearing there? Did Dahlia somehow believe her own denial? Or did she understand that once she acknowledged even one part of the recording, the rest of her position would collapse? We cannot diagnose her from an interrogation video. What we can say is that she maintained the denial in the face of evidence she had just been told was extensive. Her voice, her face, her meetings, the money, the supposed hitman himself. And that same strategy continued when she called Michael from jail. The conversation was explosive because Michael was no longer relying on what police had told him. He said he had personally heard the recordings and seen the images. Dahlia answered that what he was saying was not true. Michael could not understand the logic. How could it be false when he had watched her say it? Dahlia insisted that the evidence did not represent reality. She gave him her word. She begged him to speak to her in person and suggested she could explain everything if he would only come to see her. Michael kept returning to the details. Why had she met a man in a parking lot? Why had she handed over $1,200? Why had she said she wanted Michael dead? How had police captured her voice if none of it had happened? Then he confronted her with the line that would follow this case for years. He had heard her say she was 5,000% sure. Dahlia told him it was not true. That exchange is almost impossible to process. Michael was quoting her own recorded words back to her, and Dahlia was not arguing that he had misunderstood a vague sentence. She appeared to reject the evidence itself, even while acknowledging that she had heard what he heard and seen what he saw. Michael also challenged her about the $1,200 payment. The undercover officer had explained that the money was supposedly for a gun and other expenses. Michael wanted to know why she had handed cash to a stranger if there had been no murder plot. Again, Dahlia asked to explain in person. But beneath the argument about murder, another conflict started surfacing: money and property. Michael asked about 2 safety deposit box keys found in Dahlia's purse and wondered whether they were connected to his money. Dahlia said they were associated with ordinary papers. Then Michael turned to the house. He told her to sign the property back over to him. In Michael's view, Dahlia had taken control of something that belonged to him, and he offered to help her mother if Dahlia returned it. Dahlia refused to sign anything. That does not, by itself, prove the prosecution's eventual theory about motive, but it shows how quickly the marriage's financial disputes emerged once the murder-for-hire accusation was out in the open. Michael was talking about recordings, cash, keys, and title documents. Dahlia was asking why he would not help her. Eventually, Michael gave her the only practical advice he could. Get a lawyer. Keep quiet. Understand that the state was charging her regardless of what he did. Then Dahlia called her mother. She said the police had done this to her. She described being summoned to the house, seeing the tape around the property, and being told Michael was dead. She repeated that she had done nothing, even though police had shown her photographs and played recordings. But then her focus moved back to the house. Dahlia had heard Michael was there, and she wanted him out. She emphasized that the title was in her name. Her mother tried to steer the conversation toward the immediate problem. Dahlia was in jail and needed a lawyer. Still, Dahlia returned to the property. And that is the darkly strange part. She had just been arrested for attempting to arrange her husband's murder. Police had recorded the plan. Michael had watched her interrogation. Yet one of her urgent concerns was whether he had access to the house, and who legally controlled it. The criminal case was only beginning, but the marriage was already over. Dahlia was released the next day on a $25,000 bond and placed on house arrest while she waited for trial. Michael filed for divorce. He had survived the supposed hit, watched his wife deny knowing the man she allegedly hired, and then heard her reject the recordings during a jail call. The sting had produced the evidence. The staged death had produced the footage, and the arrest had exposed the marriage's complete collapse. But the trial would be about more than what viewers could see. It would be about intent, motive, money, and whether police had created too much of the story themselves. Because when lawyers began examining the relationship, they found a second mic, 893 messages, and a theory that the murder plot had begun long before Muhammad ever called police. The prosecution's story became more complicated when another man entered the case. His name was also Mike, and the messages between him and Dahlia appeared to describe a future that required her husband to disappear. So, just to keep this straight, because the names make it unnecessarily confusing, Michael DiPolito was Dahlia's husband and the intended target of the murder-for-hire plot. Michael Stanley was her former boyfriend, a man prosecutors said had re-entered her life while she was still married. And Stanley was not some minor figure buried in the background. Investigators recovered 893 text messages exchanged between him and Dahlia in the weeks leading up to the undercover operation. Those messages did not prove every allegation by themselves, and they could not offer a complete map of what Dahlia was thinking. But in court, prosecutors used them to construct a motive. They argued that Dahlia was not simply trying to escape an unhappy marriage. She was planning a different life with Stanley. And Michael DiPolito, along with his house, his money, and his legal problems, stood in the way. Some of the messages were intensely romantic. Dahlia reportedly called Stanley her soulmate. She wrote that they were meant to be together. She said she had already picked out names for their future children and told him she wanted to build a life with him. In other messages, the two spoke about love, sex, and how much they hated being apart. Taken alone, those could have been evidence of an affair. Ugly, yes, but not evidence of attempted murder. Then the messages turned practical. According to material presented during the legal proceedings, Dahlia discussed arranging a fake meeting at the Miami courthouse. The idea was to find someone who could pose as a legal secretary, meet Dahlia and Michael DiPolito, take a document from them, and help create the appearance of a legitimate transaction. Dahlia offered to pay that person $500. The alleged goal was to get Michael to sign the house entirely into her name. That house mattered. Michael had already transferred control of property to Dahlia because he feared his own legal problems might put his assets at risk. After the arrest, he came to believe that the anonymous reports to police, the suspicious incidents around him, and the effort to control the property were all connected. The prosecution pushed that theory much further. Other messages attributed to Dahlia and Stanley allegedly discussed trying to get Michael arrested. In one, Dahlia wrote about needing to strategize the drugs and make his arrest happen by the weekend. Another reportedly raised the possibility of contacting the Treasury Department, asking officials to examine Michael's file, and trying to freeze an account said to contain more than $100,000. Think about the progression prosecutors wanted the jury to see. First, get control of the house. Then, put Michael back in legal trouble. Freeze or reach the money. Remove him through an arrest. And if none of that worked, find someone willing to remove him permanently. That was the state's narrative. Not one impulsive conversation in a parking lot, but an escalation. Money was also tangled up with Michael's probation. Michael testified that he owed approximately $191,000 in restitution and believed paying it would help him get his long probationary term lifted. According to him, he gave a substantial amount of money to Dahlia with the understanding that it would go toward that obligation. Instead, he said, the money began disappearing into other purchases, including a Range Rover. Michael also testified about incidents he believed looked different after Dahlia's arrest. He said he once found a bag of pills near or inside the gas cap area of his vehicle and came to suspect that Dahlia had put them there. He also claimed that after drinking a Starbucks tea she gave him, he became violently ill and later believed the drink had contained antifreeze. Those were serious allegations, but they need to be described for what they were: claims raised through testimony and later litigation, not separate criminal convictions proving that Dahlia had planted drugs or poisoned him. The prosecution used those claims to support its portrait of escalation. The defense saw them as another way to turn suspicion into certainty without independently proving each accusation. By April 2011, that conflict had moved into a courtroom, and Dahlia's defense had a problem that is hard to overstate. The jury was not being asked to evaluate only the word of Mohammed Shihada, only the word of Michael DiPolito, or only the interpretation of investigators. They had recordings. They could hear Dahlia discussing the plan. They could watch her meet the undercover officer she believed was a hitman. They could hear him offer her opportunities to back out, and they could hear her say she was 5,000% sure. So the defense offered a radically different explanation. Nobody had genuinely intended for Michael to be harmed. According to that theory, the entire thing was a hoax, an acting project or an attempt to generate material for reality television. The defense suggested that Dahlia, Mohammed, and Michael were all participating in some version of the performance. In that telling, the outrageous conversations were outrageous because they were supposed to be. The hidden cameras had not exposed a murder plot. They had captured people playing roles. It was an extraordinary argument, especially because the police operation itself had been filmed while a crew from cops was working with the department. That coincidence gave the defense something tangible to point toward. Cameras really were present. The staged crime scene really was theatrical. Dahlia's reaction really did become television material. But the defense still had to explain why the supposed performers appeared to have such different understandings of the production, and why Dahlia spoke with such urgency to a man she believed could not be contacted once he left. The defense also attacked Michael directly. Michael had a criminal history. He had participated in a telemarketing fraud scheme. He had served time in prison, remained on probation, and admitted he had lied in the past, including during his supervision. If the prosecution wanted jurors to trust his account of the marriage, the money, the property, and the suspicious incidents, the defense wanted them to remember exactly who was telling that story. Cross-examination became heated. Michael could be combative, sarcastic, and visibly irritated. At one point, after comments about staring and courtroom behavior, the questioning shifted back to his dishonesty. He acknowledged that he had lied before. The defense pressed him on whether he had lied to his probation officer and whether he treated those obligations seriously. Michael's response, in essence, was that the trial was not supposed to be about him, and that was the courtroom battle in one sentence. The defense presented Michael as an unreliable former offender whose own behavior made him difficult to trust. The prosecution presented him as a deeply imperfect man who nevertheless had not asked his wife to arrange his death. Both portraits could contain truth at the same time. Michael did not need to be honest about everything for Dahlia's recorded words to matter. Dahlia herself did not testify. That left the defense to build its theory through the police operation, the reality television angle, Michael's background, and challenges to the meaning of the recordings. Prosecutors, meanwhile, linked those recordings to the 893 messages, the property transfer, the missing restitution money, the alleged arrest schemes, and Dahlia's relationship with Stanley. Their argument was simple, even if the evidence was not. Dahlia wanted the house and access to Michael's money. She wanted a future with the other Mike. When efforts to manipulate Michael's legal and financial situation allegedly failed, she escalated to a hired killer. The jury heard the secretly recorded conversations. They watched the meetings with the undercover officer. They saw footage from the staged death notification and the interrogation that followed. Whatever anyone thought about the police department's decision to turn the operation into such an elaborate production, the jurors could see Dahlia's words and actions for themselves. After roughly 3 hours of deliberation, they returned with a guilty verdict. Dahlia later said she had believed she would not be convicted. The first jury saw it differently. The judge said the evidence reached deeply into Dahlia's character and described her conduct as chilling. He adjudicated her guilty and sentenced her to 20 years in the Florida Department of Corrections, giving her credit for the time she had already spent on house arrest. For the moment, the verdict appeared to answer the through question. The jury had rejected the idea of an innocent performance and accepted that the recording showed a real plan to have Michael killed. But the conviction did not survive intact. In 2014, an appeals ruling sent the case back, and Dahlia would get another chance to argue that the spectacle had been manufactured against her. Most murder-for-hire cases end with the arrest. This one went through 3 trials, a hung jury, a changing defense strategy, and a final conviction that still left the central footage open to argument. Dahlia's first trial ended in 2011 with a guilty verdict after roughly 3 hours of jury deliberations. She received a 20-year prison sentence, with credit for the time she had already spent under house arrest. That looked like the end. It wasn't even close. In 2014, an appellate court overturned Dahlia's conviction because of problems with how the jury had been selected. That ruling did not declare her innocent. It did not erase the undercover recordings or decide that the police operation had been lawful, fair, or unfair. It meant that the process used to select the original jury had been improper enough that Dahlia was entitled to another trial. So the prosecution had to build the case again. The defense, meanwhile, had to decide what argument might work better the second time. At the first trial, Dahlia's attorneys had presented the extraordinary claim that no one genuinely intended for Michael to be harmed. The supposed murder plot, they argued, was connected to an attempt to create reality television. Dahlia, Michael, and Muhammad were said to have been participating in a hoax or acting project. But by the 2016 retrial, that explanation was no longer the center of the defense. Instead, Dahlia's attorneys turned their attention toward Boynton Beach police. And honestly, if you were looking for the most vulnerable part of the prosecution's presentation, you can understand why they chose that target. The recordings of Dahlia were damaging. Her own words were right there. But the operation surrounding those words was unusually theatrical. An undercover hitman, a fabricated burglary, police tape around a home where no murder had occurred, and officers telling Dahlia that her husband had been killed while cameras captured her reaction. Then there was the presence of the television show Cops. The revised defense argument was that investigators had not merely documented a case. They had shaped it into a production. Dahlia's attorneys accused the department of staging and exaggerating the fake crime scene because compelling television footage mattered to the officers involved. According to that theory, the cameras were not passive observers. They affected the choices police made, the speed at which the operation moved, and the dramatic way it ended. The defense also questioned the treatment of Mohammed Shihada, the man whose report had started the investigation. Attorneys argued that police pressured their confidential informant and rushed forward instead of slowing down to test the reliability and context of what Dahlia was saying. That distinction became the heart of the legal fight. The prosecution said the operation exposed intent. Dahlia had discussed killing Michael, provided money, met a man she believed was a professional hitman, and repeatedly confirmed that she wanted the plan completed. The defense said the police had created an artificial environment, pushed the players through it, and packaged the result for television. Now, those arguments do not automatically cancel the recordings. A staged crime scene afterward does not make an earlier conversation disappear. But the defense did not need every juror to accept Dahlia's full account. It needed enough doubt about intent, police conduct, or fairness to prevent a unanimous verdict. In 2016, that strategy came much closer to working. The 6-person jury split evenly. 3 jurors favored conviction, and 3 did not. A 3-3 deadlock meant a hung jury. That was not an acquittal. Dahlia was not cleared. It simply meant the jurors could not reach the unanimous decision required to end the case. After 7 years of recordings, hearings, publicity, and competing explanations, everything remained unresolved, and prosecutors chose to try her again. Before the 3rd trial began, Dahlia's personal circumstances changed. While on house arrest, she gave birth to a son. The child's father was Robert Davis, not Michael DiPolito, Michael Stanley, or Mohammed Shihada. The source material attributes a substantial arrest history to Davis, including allegations involving aggravated battery, robbery, drug possession, and grand theft. But that history did not prove anything about Dahlia's guilt, and it did not establish any connection to the 2009 murder-for-hire case. It was part of the strange personal aftermath surrounding her life while the prosecution remained unresolved. By 2017, Dahlia was entering her 3rd trial for the same alleged plot. Think about that timeline. The undercover operation had happened in August 2009. The jurors in the 3rd trial were being asked to interpret those conversations almost 8 years later, after the footage had circulated publicly and the case had already produced 1 overturned conviction and 1 deadlocked jury. The defense continued attacking both Michael's credibility and the methods used by police. Michael had admitted his own history of fraud and dishonesty. He was not the clean, uncomplicated witness prosecutors might have preferred. Dahlia's attorneys emphasized that record while continuing to argue that investigators had been motivated, at least in part, by the opportunity to produce dramatic footage. Near the end of the defense case, Dahlia's infant son was also brought to the jury's attention. The timing made the move feel calculated to critics, a late reminder that the defendant was now the mother of a young child and that a conviction would separate them. But the prosecution had its own emotional and evidentiary weight. Jurors heard Dahlia's recorded conversations. They saw her meeting the undercover officer she believed to be a hitman. They heard her affirm that she was 5,000% sure. Prosecutors were also permitted to present alleged prior conduct that had not played the same role in the second trial, including claims that Dahlia had tried to plant drugs on Michael and had poisoned a drink given to him. Those remained allegations presented as part of the state's case, not separate convictions proving every claimed act occurred exactly as described. This time, the jury reached a verdict: guilty. As a deputy moved to take Dahlia into custody, she called out for her mother. Her defense team said it was devastated and promised the fight was not over. Prosecutors, after years of reversals and retrials, publicly described the verdict as justice for the intended victim. Michael did not initially address the cameras in person, but he released a statement using the phrase that had followed Dahlia through every stage of the case. He was, he said, 5,000% happy that justice had been served once again. The line was satisfying, almost too perfectly designed for a headline. But behind it was a man who had watched police tell his wife that he was dead, then listened as she offered explanations for who might have killed him. Whatever else anyone believed about Michael's past, he had been the proposed target in the conversations the jury heard. Dahlia's final sentence was 16 years in Florida State Prison, not the 20 years imposed after her first conviction. She received credit for time already served, including qualifying time spent under house arrest. Her attorneys continued challenging the result, but the available paths kept narrowing. In 2019, the Supreme Court rejected, without comment, a request to review her conviction. That left the 2017 judgment standing. According to the custody timeline reported in the supplied material, Dahlia is expected to remain imprisoned until 2032, although release calculations can change and depend on the accuracy and currency of official records. In 2020, her attorney spoke publicly about how painful it had been for Dahlia to live apart from her son. That separation is real, whatever you think of the choices that led to it. But it also creates one more uncomfortable layer in a case already crowded with performances, conflicting stories, and consequences that reached far beyond the original marriage. The people around the case moved on, or disappeared from public view, in different ways. Mohammed Shihada, whose report to police began the entire investigation, died in late 2021. Michael later appeared publicly with a new partner, presenting a life beyond the marriage and the courtroom battle. Michael Stanley, the other Mike, whose hundreds of messages became part of the prosecution's account, has remained far less visible. His later whereabouts are not well documented in the material available here. So where does that leave the question that followed this case from the parking lot to the Supreme Court? Legally, the answer is settled. The third jury treated Dahlia's recorded conversations and conduct as proof of criminal intent. Her conviction survived the challenges that followed, and the 16-year sentence became the judgment that stood. But the defense never stopped arguing that Boynton Beach police, and the television cameras beside them, shaped what the public ultimately saw. The staged murder scene became more famous than many of the conversations that came before it. Dahlia's crying became a cultural reference point. Michael's survival became the twist everyone remembered. And somewhere inside that spectacle was a real prosecution built around a death that never happened. Michael survived. The marriage did not. Neither did the property arrangement, Dahlia's public image, or the possibility that all sides would ever agree on one clean version of the story. The case ends with a conviction, but not with every question emotionally resolved. How much of Dahlia's performance was deliberate? How much did she believe her own denials? And how much did the cameras change the way this operation would be remembered? If you want to revisit the recordings, the courtroom arguments, and the details that still divide viewers, subscribe and leave your interpretation in the comments. Because even now, the footage leaves us with two images that seem impossible to hold together. Dahlia insisting she was innocent, and Dahlia calmly telling a supposed hitman that she was 5,000% sure.